Hello and welcome to Ratio Christi Television. Science and evolution. That's what I'm talking with my next guest about in this episode. Ratio Christi is a campus apologetics alliance. We set up Christian apologetics clubs on university, college, community college, and high school campuses throughout the United States and internationally as well. Through apologetics, we're able to address the tough questions that people have about Christianity, different man-made religions out there, and also relevant world issues. The purpose of our organization is to help make people aware of the evidence for the Christian worldview, and of course, to point them to truth with a capital T, which is what we call our program, Truth Matters. Joining me is Dr. Jonathan Wells. Dr. Wells has a PhD in biology from the University of California at Berkeley and a PhD in theology from Yale University. A senior fellow at Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture, he is the author of Icons of Evolution, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Darwinism and Intelligent Design, The Myth of Junk DNA, and his newest book, Zombie Science, More Icons of Evolution. As you can see there at the bottom, they just keep coming back. So it's great to have Dr. Wells here on Ratio Christi's Truth Matters. Dr. Wells, thank you for being here.
It's a real pleasure, Tony.
It's great to have you here to discuss this always timely topic, which it seems to be. This is a topic that is brought up all the time to Christians and, of course, on college campuses and universities throughout the U.S., if not more, of course. But science is talked about many times as being in opposition to Christianity. Let's start off with defining that. What is science?
For me, and for many other people, science is a search for truth, and as such it cannot conflict with the basic truths of Christianity. We search for the truth by observing things and then coming up with ideas to explain those things. We call that hypothesis. Then we test the hypothesis against the evidence. If it fits the evidence, it might be true. If it doesn't fit, we have to change it or discard it. That's evidence-based science. For many people nowadays, however, science means something else. It means a search for materialistic explanations. Now, in materialism, materialistic philosophy, material objects and the forces among them are the only realities. Mind, soul, spirit, God, free will are just illusions. Now, a scientist doesn't have to be a materialist, but someone who believes that there are materialistic explanations for everything is practicing materialistic philosophy, or what could perhaps be known as materialistic science. This is very different from evidence-based science. For some people, science refers to the scientific establishment, the people who are trained and employed to do research and teaching. The majority opinion of the scientific establishment is called the scientific consensus. It's very different from evidence-based science. It's an opinion poll. And nowadays, the consensus is dominated by materialistic science rather than evidence-based science.
And a distinction from that, what is evolution? How do you define that?
Evolution, like science, can mean many different things. It can mean simply change over time, which nobody questions, at least not that I know. It can mean the history of the cosmos. Stars evolve. It can mean the history of technology. Technology evolves. It can also mean the fact that the living things we see around us now are not the same as the living things that lived in the distant past. Evolution can also refer to minor changes within existing species. We all know this happens. We can see it in our own families. Evolutionary biologists sometimes call this microevolution. Now, none of the senses of evolution that I've mentioned above are controversial. But in 1859, Charles Darwin proposed a theory of evolution that claimed to explain all features of all living things by descent from a common ancestor having been modified by natural selection acting on small variations. Natural selection gets rid of the bad variations and preserves the good ones, according to the theory, and this leads to change in future generations. Now, Darwin insisted that this process was unguided. He excluded design from his theory. This is very different from the other senses of evolution, most of which include design in their definition implicitly.
Now, Dr. Wells, I've noticed that a whole lot of people out there who oppose Christianity, they throw Darwin's name out there all the time. And it's interesting how many of them have actually never read any of his works, yet they use his name all the time. Like, well, that's just the defeater for Christianity, just mentioning his name, like Christianity has nothing in opposition to it. But as you as someone who has read his work, and much more than many skeptics out there who, again, just throw his name out there, what are the main points of Darwin's theory?
Well, it's interesting you frame it that way. When Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, his most famous book, he called it one long argument. And it was not an argument based on evidence. He actually had no evidence for natural selection. It was one long argument against creation by design. There's actually more theology in that book than evidence-based science. So what are the main points of his theory? Well, I said a minute ago that it's descent from a common ancestor modified by natural selection sorting through small variations. Natural selection, Darwin compared to artificial selection. That is, breeders who select features in the animals or plants that they have and allow them to breed to the exclusion of others, thereby passing on the desirable traits to future generations. This is microevolution. Darwin didn't know the source of variations. In the 1930s, his theory was combined with a theory of genetics that said the source of variation was mutation in something called genes. In 1953, after James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the structure of the DNA molecule, genes were equated in many people's minds with DNA. And so mutations, the source of new variations, became accidental changes in DNA. This is sometimes called neo-Darwinism, to distinguish it from Darwin's original theory.
Now, anyone can make an assertion about something, or anyone can throw out a theory about something, but no evidence is required if you're just making a simple assertion or a statement or a theory. But what is the actual evidence for Darwin's theory? Is there any evidence? And if so, what is it?
There's surprisingly little evidence, to tell you the truth. One major category of evidence that students are taught is minor changes within existing species, what a minute ago I called microevolution. But that's not controversial, and that's not Darwin's theory. Darwin's theory was that microevolution, given enough time, leads to what biologists call macroevolution, the origin of new species, organs, and body plans. So the evidence that students are given for microevolution is really not evidence for Darwinian evolution. A second category of evidence that students are taught is similarities among species. For example, we know that human DNA is more than 90% similar to chimpanzee DNA. And this is used as evidence that humans and chimps are descended from a common ancestor. But we can look at chimps and see that they're very different from us. Darwinism, Darwinian evolution, is supposed to explain the differences, not the similarities. So what makes us so different from chimps? The mechanism Darwin proposed, as I said, applies to microevolution, but nobody has ever seen it produce macroevolution.
Now, you have a book called Icons of Evolution. Of course, Zombie Science says more icons of evolution. What are the icons of evolution, quote unquote?
Well, in 2000, when I published Icons of Evolution, I listed 10 images that are common in biology textbooks and are used to convince students that Darwinian evolution is true. With Zombie Science last year, I added 6 more. So of the original 10, probably the most fundamental icon is the picture of Darwin's tree of life. It's the only illustration he used in his book, and it shows all organisms branching off from a common ancestor at the base. This is Darwin's tree of life. Students are usually told that it's a fact. There's so much evidence for it that we can't deny it. But actually, the evidence doesn't fit it. The more we learn about genes, the more we learn about DNA, the more we learn about anatomy, the more fragmented the tree becomes. So it doesn't actually represent evidence. It's just a symbolic representation of Darwin's main idea. Another icon of evolution is homology in vertebrate limbs. So if you look at the bones in our hands, you can find similar bones in the flipper of a porpoise, in the wing of a bat, in the wing of a bird. And again, this is supposedly evidence for their common ancestry. But we now know that these features are not passed on by DNA. We really don't know what the explanation of homology is. It could just as easily be due to common design as to common ancestry. So students are not taught the second option, only the first, that is common ancestry. Another icon of evolution, Another famous icon of evolution is drawings of embryos that supposedly show that we looked like little fish in the womb. Well, these drawings were exposed as fakes, actually, during Darwin's own lifetime. They misrepresent the series of development stages. We actually don't look at all like fish as early embryos, but students are still shown these pictures even today, 17 years or 18 years after I wrote Icons of Evolution, and told that this is evidence for Darwin's theory. So, like the other icons of evolution, these embryos, Haeckel's embryos, they were drawn by a German named Haeckel, misrepresent the evidence. They're persuasive images, but they're not true. Another one would be changes in finch beaks in finches on the Galapagos Islands. Now, scientists have observed natural selection in these birds, but once again, we're talking about microevolution, not macroevolution. No one has observed the origin of a new species there. Another icon is the peppered moth. These are light and dark colored moths that supposedly rested on tree trunks during the Industrial Revolution, and when pollution turned the trunks dark, the light moths got eaten more frequently. But in the 1980s, it turned out these moths don't really rest on tree trunks at all, not as a rule. So like the other icons, it turned out to misrepresent the evidence. Probably the final and most often seen icon is the ape to human transition. These are based on fanciful drawings of fragmentary fossil finds, and it's basically telling a story that we're descended from ape-like creatures by unguided mechanisms, and the fossils and the imaginative reconstructions of them are put into this narrative framework. It's not a framework based on the evidence, it's a framework that organizes the evidence into an argument for Darwin's theory.
And it's interesting how we hardly ever hear common creators, always that, or common designers, you had said, is always that common ancestry or evolution, like that's just a given. Oh, this is automatic evidence for Darwin's theory of evolution. But why is Darwin's theory promoted so one-sidedly in classrooms?
Well, most teachers, of course, just teach what they're told they should teach. And so they're given a curriculum written by people higher up the educational ladder. And the curriculum is designed to teach students what the scientific consensus is, the majority opinion of scientists. And the consensus of biologists these days is that Darwinian evolution is true. But as I said a few minutes ago, what's really going on is applied materialistic philosophy. And Darwin's theory happens to be the creation story of that philosophy. And so that's what's really behind the push to indoctrinate students in Darwinian evolution. Of course, students should learn the theory. I believe that. but they should study it critically, not accept it uncritically.
And I know many people as well say, hey, I'm okay with you teaching this theory, but don't negate other options. And of course, we have that creation theory is there as well, and obviously a lot of evidence for creation. Teach both. I mean, I don't understand why they don't just teach both. Say, hey, you come to your final conclusion, but at least you're putting the evidence out there for both views. It would be great if we started seeing that here more in the future. Of course, there are other schooling options that people choose to do because they do get that up front rather than it not being mentioned at all. But what is the significance of the March for Science?
Well, it's interesting. We just had one 2 days ago on April 14th, 2018. It was advertised by its organizers as a march for evidence-based science, or just as a march for science. Well, that's ridiculous. People don't march for evidence, they march for politics. So this was a march to apply political pressure to representatives and senators and congressmen and political officials for two reasons. One was to get more public money. The taxpayers of the United States support science to an enormous extent. The National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation last year spent over $40 billion of public money on science. That comes down to, I think, something over $400 per tax-paying household in this country. That's a lot of very generous support, but the marchers want more, which actually is not such a good thing. Many scientists are now pointing out that too much money corrupts science because it leads scientists to pursue the money more than the evidence. They're more interested in producing quantity than quality, and that hurts science in the long run. The second purpose of the march, political purpose, is to persuade people of the truth of two great ideas, both of them dominating the scientific establishment, the scientific consensus. One of those ideas is Darwinian evolution, which, as I said, is the creation story of materialistic philosophy. The other idea that's being promoted is man-made global warming. We are supposedly responsible for destroying the Earth. So the march is to apply pressure to political figures to do more to prevent what they see as a dangerous effect on the Earth. Well, this is kind of like, whereas Darwinism is the creation story, this is kind of like the salvation story of materialistic science. The Earth has become our God, and we're here to save it in the name of stopping man-made global warming. So that's the other purpose of the march that we just had.
Now, what can parents do in the face of this indoctrination campaign that continues on? Of course, I mentioned earlier, some parents just choose to do a different type of schooling, whether it's like a private school, homeschool, or whatever else. But what list can you give parents who are watching right now who are wondering, yeah, I'm noticing this myself, I've had enough with it, and I am trying to supplement what my child is learning in public school here in the home, but what ideas can you give them? What tips and what resources?
Well, you mentioned homeschooling. That's, in my experience, the best option, but most parents can't afford to do that. Private school would be another option. Again, most parents can't afford that. So if you have to send your children to public school, the best you can do, I think, is try to show them something about the other side. Now, there's actually some states in the United States with laws that support teachers who want to teach not just the evidence for Darwinian evolution, but the evidence against it as well. That is a more critical approach. I think parents should encourage this, especially if their state law supports it. But if they can't get their teachers to do it, if they can't apply influence on the local school board to do it, then they have to do it themselves. And there are various resources on the internet, the Discovery Institute being one of them, that provide resources for parents who want their students to see that while it's important to learn about Darwinian evolution, it's not necessary to believe it as though it were true.
Now, sometimes we have, of course, Christian parents, and their children are not Christian, so their children don't really care less whether what they're being taught in school, whether it's more of an evolutionistic view or whatever else. But then, of course, we have the opposite as well. We have times where there are students who are actual Christians and their parents are not. And sometimes the student, the child or grandchild, is more concerned about this evolutionary spotlighting than their parent or grandparent is. So what should students do in the face of this indoctrination campaign?
Well, the first job of a student is to learn. So I would encourage students in whatever situation they find themselves in to learn about the material that they're being taught. Again, as I said a minute ago, that doesn't mean swallowing it, believing it uncritically. But it's important to understand what the majority of the modern scientific establishment thinks. Children should know that. At the same time, they can take the initiative to find out more information for themselves. There are books out there, websites, videos on YouTube, including yours. And so a young man or young woman who's being forced to study Darwinian evolution should do well on the test, get a good grade, but approach the whole thing critically, not as though it's something they have to believe in spite of the evidence.
And this is something that they definitely need to keep in mind, and this is something that many parents know as well, is that, many years ago, elementary students were taught logic, law of identity, law of excluded middle, law of non-contradiction. Nowadays, you have to get to community college and then choose to take a class in critical thinking or introduction to philosophy in order to get these critical thinking skills. But nowadays, for the most part, this is what I've seen and what I've heard from many students, is they're not taught how to think, they're taught what to think. And it's a very good point that you make about, they're just given this information, and really all they need to do is just be able to repeat it on a test in order to get a good grade. But if the students out there are Christians, then they can always, they know, hey, this is what I believe, and I know why I believe it. I actually have evidence for the creationist view, but I'm going to put the answer that the teacher wants to hear in order to get a good grade on this test. So very good tips that you have there. We do have a few minutes left. Please let our audience know what they can find in your books. I know obviously Zombie Science is the newest one, but what is unique about each individual book that they may want to get that particular book for?
Well, Icons of Evolution, which I published in 2000, is about the 10 main images used in textbooks to indoctrinate students in Darwinian evolution. In 2006, I published a book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Darwinism and Intelligent Design, which presents the case for Darwinism and against it, the case for design and criticisms of it, and something about the what's going on in our society and the conflict between the two. In 2008, I published a book called The Design of Life with mathematician William Dembski, which goes into more depth on the evidence for design. I published The Myth of Junk DNA, which shows that the so-called junk DNA in us is not such junk after all. Now, when Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA in 1953, the sole function of DNA was thought to be to encode proteins. But it soon became obvious that most of our DNA, about 98% of it, does not encode proteins. And so many biologists called it junk and said it was a result of unguided evolution. They've also used it as evidence against design. Why would a designer fill up our genome with junk? But as we learn more and more about the DNA, we learn that this so-called junk turns out not to be junk at all. It has actual functions. In fact, according to many biologists, most of our DNA functions in one way or another. So that's what the myth of junk DNA is about. Then, of course, the book Zombie Science, which I wrote about a year ago, lists 6 additional icons of evolution. They're not new. They've been around a long time, like the original 10, but I could only fit so many in the first book. Things like the human eye is badly designed. Well, that turns out not to be true, and the people who argue that, people such as Richard Dawkins, argued it after the evidence was already there to show that the eye is very well designed indeed. So zombie science goes into more detail about that, about DNA, about whales. Supposedly whales are evidence for evolution. It turns out it's not so straightforward. Things are a lot more complicated than that. And Darwinism continues to be pushed, as I said, not because it grows out of the evidence, but because it's a materialistic creation story, and the people behind it want to indoctrinate our children in materialistic philosophy.
Dr. Wells, I sure hope that our viewers do get all of your books, as well as check out your websites, Icons of Evolution, and also discovery.org. It's been a blessing to have you here with me on this episode. Thank you for informing our audience about science and evolution and more details that they need to know about each. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Tony. I've enjoyed it.
Friends, look at the available evidence, we find that the Christian worldview aligns with reality. We need to think about our need for a Savior, and salvation is found only in the Lord Jesus Christ. Please check out our website and also look at all the different resources that we have there. We have a whole lot of stuff. If you want to know if we have a chapter in your area, just go to the website, go up to the top, click on chapters. You'll see a world map where we have geopins all over the place. Our chapter number continues to grow higher and higher. We continue to have new chapters started in states where we haven't had any chapter before. There are many other states where we have 10 to 15 chapters, if not more. Let's look and see if we have one in your area. If not, contact Ratio Christi. If you are a student, if you are a faculty member who would like to be a faculty advisor for a club, or if you are an apologist and you want to be a chapter director, whether that is a volunteer or if you want to get paid as a supported missionary. Yes, we do have part-time and full-time positions available. Again, just go to ratiochristi.org to find out more about that and just what our ministry is doing, and many different niches of the ministry that we have. Of course, here, Truth Matters is just one of the niches of reaching people in their homes who aren't on campus. And of course, students who aren't in high school yet, or even people who are already out of college. But please support this ministry financially, and please pray for us. That will allow this vital work to continue. And remember, when it comes to what we believe and why we believe it, truth matters.